What if the Earth we know, the breathing, turning, dreaming Earth, only began the moment it was broken? Once, long ago, in a part of the solar system still raw with newness, there was a collision. Not gentle, not quiet. A young planet, proto-Earth, still gathering its skin, still molten in places, was struck by something nearly its own size. We call it Theia now, though no one truly knows. The names are ours. The silence was theirs. In that single unimaginable impact, both worlds came undone, and something new began. From fire and disintegration, from the dust of two ancient bodies, the Earth we stand on now began to take shape, and above it, circling endlessly ever since, the moon was born. Not captured, not adopted, but created from Earth's own bones. A twin of sorts, a ghost sibling, a memory carved in orbit. It's easy to forget the moon is a piece of us, that its light is not its own, but borrowed, reflected, that it carries the trauma of our birth not in legend, but in craters and crust. And yet, without it, would there have been tides? Would there have been balance? Would life, any life at all, have found its rhythm in the sway of oceans and the tug of gravity? No one knows exactly what the world was like in those earliest days, right after the moon rose from the ashes. There are no fossils, no maps, only isotope ratios in ancient rock, scattered like broken syllables in a story too old to read. But even those whispers tell us something. That Earth's rotation was faster than a frantic spinning, 5 hours, maybe 6, to complete a day. The moon, much closer, loomed enormous in the sky. It would have pulled at the seas with immense force, dragging the waters across volcanic coasts that steamed and hissed with barely formed atmosphere. What kind of world begins in chaos and becomes calm? What kind of calm is that? Maybe Earth was never meant to be alone. Maybe solitude would have left her tilted too far, spinning wild, her seasons broken, her oceans still. Maybe the moon is not just a witness but an anchor, a silent partner in the slow story of life. Not because it shines, but because it steadies, because it holds us in place as we dream forward. And if that's true, if our planet's very nature depends on another body pulled from its own heart, then what does that say about origins? About identity? About the boundaries between self and other? Could it be that the Earth we know, the only home we've ever had, is not a singular entity at all, but the afterglow of a long-forgotten union? A scar that became a system? A memory that became a moon? The rocks remember in their way. The earliest minerals, tiny zircon crystals locked inside ancient grains, hold clues to how the surface cooled and when. They suggest that oceans may have formed earlier than we once thought. That water, the great dissolver, came not in sudden storms, but in vapors and rains, gentle and endless. Perhaps seeded by comets, perhaps born from within, perhaps both. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that Earth, broken and burning, began to soften, to calm, to carry silence. And while the moon circled, farther each year, still drifting away at the speed of fingernails growing, Earth became something new. But was that transformation inevitable? Entropy tells us that systems tend toward disorder. And yet, Earth seems to have moved in the other direction, toward complexity, toward life, against the odds, against the noise. Is it possible that the impact, the splitting, the chaos, somehow made order more likely? Could the collision have been a kind of unlikely genesis? Not a mistake, not a tragedy, but a beginning. We like to think of time as a straight line, before, after, cause, effect. But in deep time, in planetary time, the boundaries blur. What came first may not matter. What mattered is what endured. And what endured was partnership. For all our separation, the moon and Earth are bound by story. One reflects, one remembers, one stirs the tides, one carries life. You cannot have one without the other, not truly. They were born from the same destruction. They evolved together. They move as one. And maybe that's what Earth has always been learning. How to be more than itself. How to echo. How to orbit. How to hold memory in motion. Because even now, billions of years later, the signs of that union remain. in the rock record, in the ocean's pull, in the way our nights are lit by a light that has no flame. We walk on the surface of a planet that was once an explosion. And maybe we, too, are shaped by that inheritance. The need for companionship, the pull of rhythm, the longing to remember where we began. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The earth, once torn open by impact, did not settle quickly. It breathed fire. The sky, such as it was, shimmered with heat and metal vapor. The crust had not yet formed a skin of permanence, only temporary rafts of cooling rock floating atop a sea of molten memory. This was not the planet we know, not yet. It was restless, half-born, and the sky above it was not blue, but glowing, thick, choked with the particles of collision and the breath of volcanoes too young to know silence. The air itself may have been more mineral than gas, heavy with silicates, iron vapor, suspended droplets of lava falling like rain, and steam hissing from every crack in the planet's skin. Temperatures soared beyond what we now call survivable, but there was no life yet to survive or perish. Only chemistry, only heat, only motion. The sky did not catch fire in a single moment, it was fire, a canopy of brightness that never dimmed, where lightning had no silence between strikes and storms raged with nothing to cool them. A perpetual twilight of red and orange, illuminated from within, pulsing in waves. It may have looked like a dream, or like something waking up from one. Down below, the ground was not still. Vast oceans of magma surged and churned, reshaping themselves constantly. No continent could take hold. No mountain could last. Everything was flux. Everything was motion. Even the beginnings of a crust were fleeting, rising in plates, sinking again, like thoughts forgotten mid-formation. Geologists believe this was the Hadean Aeon, named for the underworld, not because it was evil, but because it was unknowable, a place without records, without fossils, without sound. And yet it was not empty. It was becoming. Perhaps, within that inferno, something strange was happening. Maybe the seeds of stability were already stirring. Is it possible that even chaos follows patterns too slow for us to perceive? Could the heat have been necessary, not just inevitable? A crucible, not a catastrophe? In the slow cooling of a fiery planet, entropy did not mean collapse. It meant transformation. Atoms rearranged themselves. New minerals formed under pressures so great they would shatter anything we could build now. Oxygen was trapped inside rocks. Iron separated from silicates and began sinking inward, pulled by gravity into the core, forming the beginnings of Earth's magnetic field. Not because the Earth wanted it, but because matter follows laws, because motion seeks order, because even in the violence of planetary birth, there are currents moving toward possibility. If we could stand there, somehow shielded from the heat, from the radiation, from time itself, we wouldn't see a peaceful world. But we might see beauty, the beauty of a sky that was glowing from within, of rivers made of lava branching like veins, of landscapes forming and vanishing in the same breath. This was a world before erosion, before memory, before even the moon had settled into its now familiar path. A time of first breath, and every breath was fire. And still the sky held onto its heat. The sun, dimmer than today, was distant, but the planet burned brighter from within than it ever would again. Internal heat, left over from formation, from collisions, from the decay of radioactive elements, kept Earth alive in a way it no longer remembers. And perhaps that's the quietest mystery of all, that the Earth forgets. Geology is the study of this forgetting, of looking into stone and seeing what once was molten, of reading oxygen isotopes in tiny grains of zircon to guess the temperature of oceans that may have existed when the sky was still flame, of holding fragments of a time that never wrote anything down. Maybe the Earth does not remember in words, but in elements, in layers, in subducted crust and uplifted peaks. And yet, for all we can infer, the Hadean remains largely invisible. Not because it lacked drama, but because fire doesn't fossilize. So we wonder, we drift through imagination because the evidence is incomplete. What did the first rains look like, falling into that brightness? Did they boil before they touched the ground? Did they cool the rock or anger it? Was the water always coming? Or did it only arrive once the sky began to rest? And if this was how Earth found its shape, not through peace but through burning, then what else in the universe might be born the same way? What other worlds are catching fire right now? Their skies glowing red, their futures still molten. What does it mean for a planet to burn its way into identity? And when the fire cools, what comes next? And when the fire cooled, what came next? Not life, not rivers, not forests reaching for light. What came next was silence. The kind of silence that lingers after something breaks, after the heat recedes, after the violence withdraws into memory. It wasn't a silence we would recognize, not peaceful, not still in the way a quiet forest might be still. It was the absence of air, of waves, of breath. The silence of a world with no voice yet. A planet made of stone, drifting between stars, wrapped in its own heat like a wound healing too slowly to see. The molten seas had begun to harden. Surface crusts, fragile and thin, formed and fractured again. Cooling was never total, only relative. Beneath every rock layer, heat still pulsed. And above it all, the moon hung low in the sky, closer than it would ever be again, casting shadows on a surface that did not yet know time. The Earth had no atmosphere to scatter light, no clouds to paint it, only radiation from space, only ultraviolet silence, only the long hush of a planet waiting to become something else. Geologists say this phase may have lasted millions of years, perhaps longer. It's hard to tell because the record of that time was mostly erased, subducted, recycled, ground down into the deep folds of mantle and sea. We look for traces in the oldest surviving crust, slivers of ancient zircon, fragments of proto-continent, crystals hardened inside forgotten stone, and we listen. Not with ears but with instruments, with isotope trails, with temperature imprints, with the slow reading of ratios that speak in echoes. Could it be that silence has a shape? That the absence of noise leaves an imprint? 2. We often think of impact as an ending. But the collision that formed Earth's second self, the moon, was also a beginning. In its aftermath, this hush was not emptiness. It was potential. In every cooling basin, in every fracture along the surface, in every slow convecting swirl beneath the crust, something was shifting. Pressure, minerals, chemistry, and time. Always time. Slow, geological time. Time that does not rush, but accumulates. Maybe the Earth was not waiting. Maybe it was preparing. Not because it knew, but because matter responds. Because gravity pulls. Because energy flows. Maybe this was the first moment when stillness became structure. Imagine a world without oceans. No tides. No erosion. No sounds but the slow cracking of stone and the groaning of heat beneath. A place where every grain of dust was new. Every hill untouched. Every plain a canvas for future tectonics. There was no memory here yet, only the beginning of it. And in that beginning, there was quiet. Entropy had not yet painted its full design. Decay had not yet claimed its rhythm. The forces that would break mountains, swallow crust, and sculpt valleys had not yet emerged. They would come. But for now, Earth was only just beginning to remember that it was Earth. And perhaps this is what the planet needed. A cradle, a pause, a long breath after destruction. Not because healing must be quiet, but because form must be allowed to settle. Because even rock, even molten history, needs a moment to rest before it reshapes. We tend to forget that silence is not the opposite of change. Sometimes it is the soil it grows from. And in that quietude, a question lingered, one we still ask, even now. How long does it take for a planet to become more than stone? And if silence held the first answer, what was the second? Perhaps it came not from Earth itself, but from what circled it. Above the cooling stone, past the still-forming crust and the vapor-wrapped sky, a presence moved, steadily, silently. The moon, born from the same impact that shattered Earth into what it would become, was no longer a scattered cloud of debris. It had gathered. It had taken shape. And now it danced. Not in celebration, but in orbit. In distance. In repetition, we call it a satellite, a companion, a mirror without light of its own. But it is more than that. It is gravity's quiet reminder that no world spins entirely alone. The moon did not simply float beside Earth. It began to shape it, to shape us. With each pass, it tugged gently on the oceans that were just beginning to pool. Pulled water toward itself and then released it. Pulled and released. A rhythm was born. A beat, not of music, but of motion. One that continues still, lapping against shorelines, weaving through our blood, hidden in the cycles of sleep and breath. Before the moon's orbit, Earth had no rhythm. Days rushed by in 5-hour spins, wild and uncertain. But now, the drag of tides began to slow the turning. Not all at once, not quickly, but over eons, the planet began to breathe more slowly, to stretch its days, to settle into a pulse. Could it be that identity needs repetition? That something becomes real only when it repeats? The moon's orbit isn't a perfect circle. It wobbles, it shifts, but it endures. And with its enduring came the birth of shadows. Shadows cast not by fire, but by geometry. Eclipses, phases, crescents, and fulls. The moon began to cast silhouettes upon the Earth, and the Earth began to cast them back. Not just light blocked by form, but an interplay, a choreography of presence and absence, a visual language carved from light and stone. Maybe that's when perception began. Maybe it wasn't just the presence of another, but the patterns it made, the markings on time. The sky began to tell a story. Not through stars, those came later, but through the moon's return, through the way it shrank and grew, waxed and waned. And even if no one was there to watch, the pattern was real. The calendar had already begun, long before clocks, long before thought. The moon, drifting farther away with every orbit, remains the keeper of this early language. Even now, it escapes us at the pace of fingernails growing. A slow retreat, a quiet goodbye stretched across deep time. But while it stays, it holds us steady. It cradles the Earth's tilt, protects our seasons, shields us from chaos. Not because it chooses to, but because it's bound. And maybe that's what companionship really is, not choice but gravity. Not presence but pull. The moon pulls at our oceans, our tides, our tectonic shifts. We in turn pull at it, locked in a slow spiral of mutual memory. One turning around the other, bound even as we drift apart. What did it mean to become a planet with a partner? Perhaps it meant inheriting a new kind of time. A time not just of ages and rocks and elements, but of rhythm, of cycles, of recurrence. Entropy still ruled, but now there was something else. A return, a loop, a shadow cast again and again across the same surface. And in that looping, something strange occurred. Prediction, repetition gave rise to expectation. Even in the molten mind of a young Earth, the beginnings of pattern had arrived. Not intelligence, but motion that remembered itself. The moon orbited, the tides responded, the days grew longer, and the Earth began to feel not just the silence of becoming, but the structure of being. And if structure could emerge from chaos, what else might follow it? Maybe the answer came not in fire, but in vapor. Not in thunder, but in a long, slow condensation. After the skies dimmed and the molten breath of Earth cooled into crust, something softer began. The air, once filled with silicates and flame, began to shift. Not all at once, but with time. Always time. Steam gathered where there had been gas. Minerals released what they had held in secret. And from the rubble of impacts, icy messengers from distant reaches of the solar system, droplets fell. Not with fury, but with patience, with persistence. They fell through a sky that had never felt rain before. And when they reached the ground, they sizzled on hot stone, vanished into mist, then circled back again. Water was never one thing. It came from many places, delivered by comets, drawn out of rocks, born from the collision of hydrogen and oxygen in a world still experimenting with chemistry. Some of it was always here, folded into the minerals from Earth's birth. Some of it came from beyond, riding on ancient ice, thrown from far orbits. and still more formed from the reactions of the crust itself. No single source, just the same element, arriving in many costumes, slowly, quietly, until it became a presence too vast to ignore. How do you make oceans from emptiness? You wait. You let the planet breathe. You let the steam swirl. You let gravity pull the smallest droplets into rivulets, and the rivulets into streams, and the streams into basins. You let the basins deepen, over centuries, over millennia, until they forget what they were before they held water. You let the heat release. You let the sky weep. And eventually, it pools. Not instantly, not predictably, but inevitably. There is a beauty in the idea that the oceans are made of memory, of vapor that once rose from stone, of impacts from faraway ice worlds that no longer exist, of chemistry played out across a billion quiet experiments. Oceans are not foreign to the Earth. They are its own thoughts, liquefied. They are its size, cooled into permanence. And in every drop there are clues. Clues in the isotopes, in the deuterium ratios, in the salinity that hints at ancient rocks long eroded. The water remembers things the continents forgot. Even now, scientists debate how much of the oceans came from within and how much fell from beyond. The truth may be that it doesn't matter. That the sea is not about origin but accumulation. Not a source but a gathering. Perhaps everything meaningful is like that, layered, assembled, emergent. Maybe life too will follow. And what did the world look like when the first true oceans formed? It may have looked strange. The land was minimal, a few cratons rising like islands of basalt, surrounded by vast, steaming waters. The sky still thick, still choked with carbon dioxide and sulfur, but softening. Light broke through now and then. Sunlight touched the waves and refracted in colors no eyes yet existed to see. Tides pulled and pushed against these primeval shores, directed by the moon's strong grip. Rainfall continued, slow and endless, painting the land with erosion before life had a chance to respond. The oceans were not blue yet. They may have been greenish with iron, or cloudy with minerals, or dark with the heat that still lingered below. But they were forming, and as they formed, they changed everything. Water began to shape the land, cooled the crust. It carved riverbeds and canyons before plants or roots or fish had names. And it brought with it possibility. The chemistry of life requires solvents. Water is the great dissolver, the quiet negotiator between elements, the space in which complexity can arise, not because it chooses to, but because it allows. Is it possible that the earth became itself only when it became wet? That the fire made its bones, but the water gave it thought? We do not know exactly when the first ocean covered the first continental shelf. The record is partial, lost, recycled through subduction zones, erased in the churn of plates and time. But the signs are there, scattered across ancient zircon, locked in sediments older than memory. They whisper of a time when the air began to cool, and the sky stopped burning, and the world, at last, began to reflect. Not because it was calm, but because it was ready. And if water could gather from dust and steam, from impact and stone, what else might it carry with it? What quiet seeds might it already have begun to cradle beneath its restless waves? And if water could gather from dust and steam, from impact and stone, what else might it carry with it? What quiet seeds might it already have begun to cradle beneath its restless waves? As oceans formed and deepened, they did not simply cover the earth, they began to shape it. Beneath the surface, the crust fractured, folded, lifted. Proto-continents, young, unstable, rose like questions from the sea. They were not yet the familiar shapes of maps. Not the sweeping arms of Pangaea, not the scattered outlines of modern nations. These were earlier forms, lesser known, some too brief to even be named. Pieces of land that lifted into the air, then slipped back beneath the waves again, lost not to catastrophe, but to time. There are hints of them, whispers in ancient minerals, hints in cratons so old they barely hold together, scraps of buried rock far older than their surroundings. Places like Vulbara, Uar, and Kennerland. Not mythical but incomplete. Not fantasy but fragment. Their outlines are guessed from magnetism, from isotope trails, from the alignment of ancient mountain roots. They may have floated alone across vast seas, lonely and eroding, collecting sediments that would later become stone, then mountain, then dust again. And still they vanished. Subduction, erosion, burial, transformation. The earth does not keep what it does not need. Some of these continents folded into others. Some were dragged downward into the mantle. Some were ground into sand. There is no monument to them. No fossils of forests. Only chemistry. Only grain. Only absence. Could it be that Earth was always experimenting? That it tried different shapes, different balances, different arrangements of land and sea again and again, testing what worked, what held, what could last? Maybe these lost continents were sketches, drafts of what Earth could become. Not because they failed, but because change is constant. Because even rock, even crust, is never truly finished. And what would it mean to walk on one of those forgotten lands, if they rose again? Would the stones remember their first sky? Would they carry imprints of atmospheres long vanished? Could their grains still echo the rhythm of tides that no longer exist? There is a place in the Indian Ocean called the Seychelles, where the granite beneath your feet is not volcanic island rock, but continental crust. A remnant, a survivor, a fragment of something that was once whole and then wasn't. Other clues lie buried beneath Antarctica, beneath the oceans, beneath the Himalayas. Not visible, not obvious, but there. If we know how to listen. The continents we know today, Asia, Africa, the Americas, are not the original ones. They are merely the latest. Temporary, like everything else. Slow-moving, immense, but transient. And the ones before them? Forgotten not by accident, but by design. The planet recycles. It reuses. It buries. And in doing so, it clears the slate. What if the Earth is a palimpsest? A manuscript written and erased over and over again, with each new version written on the bones of the last. What does that mean for memory? For permanence? For what we believe can be known? Perhaps land is not as solid as it feels. Perhaps even the ground beneath our feet is a story in flux, a shape still shifting. We mark our borders in stone, build our cities on what we call stable ground. But the crust itself moves, it forgets, it sinks. And if continents can disappear, if entire worlds can rise and fall and be erased without a trace, then what else might we be standing on right now without knowing it? What else has vanished so completely that we no longer remember it was even real? Perhaps the sky. Not the sky we know now. Blue and breathable, scattered with birds, traced by clouds. But an earlier sky. A sky I would have dared open beneath. Thick with haze. Heavy with unbreathable gas. The sun above it was still the same sun, but dulled, shrouded in atmospheric weight, dimmed through layers of methane and carbon dioxide and sulfuric vapor. The light that reached the surface was not golden, but red, long, slanting wavelengths filtering through a world not yet softened by oxygen. A sun that bled through fog. A sky that burned in silence. And still, it was beautiful in its own way. Strange and silent and shimmering. The kind of sky that hummed without sound. That painted the oceans not with sparkle, but with shadow. There was no blue here yet. No sky to reflect. Only the deep rust of iron-rich seas, turned crimson in the filtered sun. And above, clouds that formed without water as we know it, seeded instead by volcanic ash, by mineral vapor, by the alchemy of a planet still learning what to be. The atmosphere was not a shelter then. It was a veil, a warning. Methane, the gas of decay, filled the upper air. Ammonia drifted in pockets. Hydrogen escaped into space, slowly, a breath never to return. There was no ozone to shield from ultraviolet light. No oxygen to spark flame or lungs or song. And yet change was brewing. Not because the air was kind, but because it was unstable. Every molecule was a question waiting to be asked. Chemistry stirred in the shadows. Lightning forked across the sky without rain. Volcanoes exhaled from the deep carbon, ash, heat, and metal. The crust cracked and shifted. The oceans churned with heat from below. And somewhere, Between these layers of air and water and rock, possibilities began to stir. Could it be that poison is not the opposite of life, but its precondition? That a hostile sky doesn't prevent emergence, but prepares it? This atmosphere, this alien blend of gases, may have been the very crucible from which life's first breathless forms emerged. Not in sunlight, but in shadow. Not in oxygen, but in chemical gradients at the bottom of oceans, or near boiling vents, or in shallow puddles touched by cosmic rays. The air above could not nourish, but it could protect. Not because it was pure, but because it was thick. Dense enough to keep out the worst of the solar wind. Cloaked enough to buy time. And in that time Earth changed. Slowly. Not visibly. Not at first. But with patience. Tiny microbes, if they were there, began to exhale their futures. Traces of oxygen started to appear in rock. Oxidized minerals that told of a breath taken, a change begun. Stromatolites, layered structures formed by microbial mats, hinted at colonies forming in the shallows. Not life as we know it, but life as process, as repetition, as quiet, almost imperceptible change. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but builds momentum over millions of years. Entropy again played its part. Energy moved through systems, was used, was spent, was released. The planet didn't resist decay. It used it. And the air, once poisonous, began to shift. Gases reacted. Heat was trapped. Climate oscillated. Some gases left. Others stayed. And through it all, the light remained red. What would it have felt like to stand there, in a body that didn't yet exist, and look up into that heavy sky? To watch the sun smear itself across a methane dome, to feel the pressure of an atmosphere not made for breath? Would it have felt like a beginning? Or an ending? Maybe both. Maybe the sky had to be dangerous before it could be kind. Maybe the world had to test every version of itself before finding the one that could hold us. And yet, if light could change its color, and air could trade one poison for another, what else might this world be willing to become? Perhaps the answers don't come from the sky. Perhaps they lie beneath our feet, in fragments, in dust, in minerals so small they can barely be seen, but so old they remember what the earth has forgotten. Not fossils, not bones, but zircons, the oldest solids we have ever found. Tiny crystals, barely thicker than a strand of hair, locked inside ancient rocks. And inside those crystals, time. Zircons are not made to tell stories, but they do. Trapped within them are traces of uranium, decaying steadily into lead across eons. Their isotopes hold chemical memories, snapshots of temperature, of pressure, of elements that once moved freely through oceans and magma. When everything else has melted, eroded, subducted, or been erased, these remain. Fragments of Earth's earliest skin. Stones that remember the heat. Some of these zircons are over 4.3 billion years old. Born just a whisper after the Earth itself. When the crust was young. When the oceans were just beginning. When the moon was still pulling hard at the tides and the skies still ran red. And yet these crystals formed. In water. In magma. In silence. In places we'll never see. Beneath the ground. Under pressures we can barely simulate. They cooled. They hardened. And they endured. What do they whisper to us? They speak in ratios. In isotope decay. In the presence of oxygen or the lack of it. They tell us the Earth may have had liquid water earlier than we imagined. That crust may have formed, disappeared, then reformed again. That volcanic cycles pulsed even in those distant days. That perhaps, just perhaps, there were environments gentle enough, stable enough for something more to stir. But they do not remember everything. Zircons forget motion. They do not capture wind, or rain, or the rhythm of waves. They do not hold scent, or color, or sound. They are memory without context. Numbers without emotion. But still, they hold enough. Enough to remind us that even when the world was molten, something had already begun to cool, to crystallize, to wait. And maybe that's what these stones are, not evidence but patience. Not because they knew to wait, but because they simply endured long enough to be found. Could it be that deep time isn't just about scale, but about stillness? That to outlast entropy you must surrender to it? That memory, real memory, is not loud or large, but quiet and small, and hidden in places most will never look? We often think of history as something told in monuments, in fossils, in scrolls. But the earliest story we have is written in crystal. Not in words, but in chemistry. Not in sequence, but in presence. A breath of hafnium here, a trace of uranium there. Cooling temperatures locked into the lattice of a gem too small to touch without tools. And yet, when we study them, when we break them open, scan them with lasers, weigh the atoms inside, we are not destroying the past. We are listening. We are tracing the edges of a forgotten world, one element at a time. What else might lie hidden in minerals too small to catch the light? What other whispers might be locked inside stone? And if a crystal can outlast continents, can survive bombardments, subductions, ice ages, and firestorms, then what does that say about memory? Not the kind we write down, but the kind the earth carries for us. Quietly, unwillingly, endlessly. And if the stones can remember the heat, what else might they be trying to tell us? Hidden beneath the rhythm of decay? What patterns still lie untouched, waiting beneath our feet? What else is buried that never wanted to be forgotten? Perhaps the rain. Not the kind we know today, soft or sudden, passing through the atmosphere like breath, but an older rain, the first rain. A rain that did not arrive in intervals, but in epochs. That did not stop to give way to sun or sky. That fell in silence, for years, for centuries, until the ground no longer resisted. Until even stone began to soften beneath its rhythm. We imagine the moment the skies began to clear, when steam finally cooled into droplets, when Earth's overheated breath condensed into falling water. But it wasn't a moment. It was a shift, a surrender. The heat faded, slowly. The pressure lessened. And the vapor, trapped in a sky of gas and mineral, began to descend. Not with thunder, not with drama, but steadily, constantly, as if the planet had exhaled and could not take the breath back. And so it rained. It rained without pause. Daylight meant nothing. There was no life to mark the hours, no trees to catch the drops, no dry ground waiting beneath. Only basalt and early crust, raw and fractured, spread wide like skin not yet healed. The rain didn't fall on the land, it carved it. Dressed in erosion, the water traced every crack, found every weakness, pulled particles free. Streams formed, then rivers. Rivers widened into temporary seas. Valleys opened where none had been. The earth, barely cooled, was reshaped again. Not by fire, but by something quieter, something patient. Could it be that the memory of a planet is not just held in stone, but in how that stone has been worn down? Erosion is not destruction. It's revision. A conversation between solid and fluid, heat and cool, pressure and release. Every drop of rain that fell in those first centuries carried more than water, it carried intention. It moved sediment from high to low. It smoothed chaos. It prepared the land for something it could not yet imagine. We find the evidence now in layers. In banded iron formations, in sedimentary rocks that fold like chapters of an unspoken story. We read it in clay, in silt, in valleys that still follow ancient paths. The shapes of continents, the gentle bends of rivers, the curves of coastlines. They all began here, in this long and endless rain. And still, the water did not rest. The rain triggered chemical changes in the rock. It leached elements from the crust, dissolving minerals and leaving behind patterns. Stripes of iron, halos of silica, trails of potassium and calcium. It made the surface reactive. It gave the land texture. And beneath that land, it began to seep deeper, into the fractures, into the heat below, touching molten rock and returning to the surface as steam again. A cycle was born, not just of water, but of transformation. A loop that would carry forward forever. Maybe this was the first sign of memory forming, not in what was made, but in what was unmade. The hills that were lost, the ridges flattened, the mountains never allowed to rise. All of it left a kind of negative space, a shape defined not by presence, but by absence. Could it be that this is how the earth began to hold memory? Not in what it kept, but in what it let go. Entropy always pulls toward disorder. But within erosion there is a strange order too. A flowing, guided loss, pattern etched by wear. Water does not destroy the world, it reveals it. Slowly, invisibly, drop by drop. And still, it rained. The centuries passed. The rain continued. Oceans swelled. Rivers deepened. Sediments thickened. The earth became softer, gentler, not because it chose to be, but because rain asked it to be. And the planet slowly said yes. What did it mean for a world once ruled by fire to yield to water? Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. Maybe the earth in those long rains was becoming ready, not just for life, but for time, for story, for the kind of complexity that can only grow in places that have been shaped, worn, smoothed. Life would need water, but it would also need terrain, texture, places to cling to evolve, to remember. And if all of that began in falling rain, what might the next drop hold? What else does erosion still carry with it, quietly, toward the sea? Perhaps something more elusive than sediment. Perhaps the faintest trace of time before memory. A time before fossils, before shells, before bones, before anything had a name or left behind the echo of a form. We think of the past as something we can touch. But there was an age, an immense, vanishing age, where nothing that lived had left a shape behind. The Precambrian, not a name from nature, but one we gave to what nature never recorded. A stretch of time so vast it swallows most of Earth's history, and yet we know so little of it, because fossils, those quiet testaments of ancient life, had not yet begun. There were no exoskeletons to preserve, no teeth to fall into mud, no coral to petrify into reef. Life was soft, fluid, microscopic, ephemeral. It lived, it changed, it perished, and it left almost nothing behind. And still it was there. We find traces in stromatolites, layered microbial structures built slowly in the shallows. Not fossils exactly, but architectures of community. Life stacking itself upward toward the light, colony upon colony, each too small to hold alone but powerful in their togetherness. They built mounds, ridges, sheets of film that stiffened over time, patterns that hint at intention, or at least persistence. But what about the creatures too soft to leave stone behind? What about the forms that dissolved the moment they died, washed away before they ever touched silt? Could it be that entire lineages rose and vanished, not over millions of years, but in moments, and all without a trace? Maybe the earth has carried more lives than it can count. Maybe the lives that left no skeletons are the very ones that paved the way for those that did. Time before fossils is not empty. It is full. Full of things that once moved through water, drew energy from minerals, split themselves in two to continue, only to disappear again. They altered the atmosphere. They altered the oceans. They changed the chemistry of everything, and still they did not leave a single bone. Just whispers in isotope ratios. Just odd patterns in ancient rock. Just the suspicion of presence, without proof. And what does it mean to exist without record? Is memory only real when it's preserved? Or can something matter, even if it's been erased? We often say history began with writing. But long before ink, there were stones. Long before stones, there was life. And long before life left bones, it changed the world. Oxygen, once deadly to early microbes, began to rise in the atmosphere because of their quiet labor. Their breath shifted the sky. Their waste made air. The great oxidation event was not an explosion. It was a slow unveiling, a planetary breath, stretched across hundreds of millions of years. Maybe memory isn't always about what is kept, but about what is caused. Maybe those soft-bodied beings, long vanished, are still here, not in form, but in effect. We breathe because they once breathed. We walk on continents shaped by their presence. And though we cannot see them in the rock, we live in the world they made. Could it be that the most important lives are the ones we'll never find? That the truest fossils are not bones, but atmospheres, oceans, habits? And if all of this unfolded in a time before memory, what else might have happened? Right beneath the silence? Because the earth even then was stirring. Not on the surface, not where eyes might one day look, but deeper beneath the rain, beneath the oceans, beneath the youngest layers of the crust. It stirred not with suddenness, but with something slower, something older, a planetary pulse faint at first, then stronger. The beginnings of movement, the start of breath. Tectonics had not yet settled into the patterns we know now. There were no familiar plates, no drifting continents. But the crust, the thin skin above the mantle, was no longer still. Heat, trapped from formation and fueled by the slow decay of radioactive elements, began to rise. Mantle plumes, columns of semi-molten rock, pushed upward from below, softening the lithosphere, warping its surface. Cracks opened, not like wounds but like breaths, fissures that let magma spill into the oceans, cool into basalt, then vanish beneath again. The surface buckled, folded, sank. Could it be that this was the first sign of Earth trying to shape itself? Not from the outside, but from within. What does it mean when a planet starts to move, not just react, but direct? Subduction, that slow recycling of crust into mantle, may have begun here. Not everywhere, not yet, but in places. Slabs of oceanic rock, heavier and colder, began to slide beneath the lighter ones. They disappeared into the planet's body, dragging with them water, minerals, sediments, memories. The seafloor didn't just form, it erased itself, and in doing so it wrote something new. The cycle had begun. Creation through destruction, formation through collapse. Not because the earth sought balance, but because it could no longer hold still. This motion, this restlessness was not chaos. It was pattern, a pulse, a quiet rhythm repeated over time until it became the planet's breath. We see the remnants now in ancient terrains. Slivers of crust that once belonged to other places, sutured into the continents like drifting thoughts stitched into the body of the present. Rocks older than their neighbors, minerals that don't belong, islands that traveled thousands of miles without ever leaving the sea. And beneath it all, the heat kept moving. Volcanoes rose, not yet in rings, but in scattered swells. Arcs of fire at the edge of subduction zones. Ridges in the deep sea where new crust emerged like pages being written. Earth was beginning to tell its story in layers. Not words, not fossils, but folds, pressure, heat, uplift, erosion, repeat. Could it be that tectonics is not just geology but memory in motion? That the surface of the Earth is not fixed, but fluid, constantly reworking its past into something new? There is something almost biological in it. Planet exhaling heat, inhaling stone, circulating elements from deep within to the sky and back again. An internal engine that doesn't stop, even now, even as we sleep. And maybe long before lungs evolved, this was what breathing meant. Not respiration, but renewal. A way for a world to become more than a rock. A way for the interior to speak to the surface. A language made not of sound, but of movement. A language that took millions of years to form a single sentence. Even now, we are still reading it. In the tilt of ancient mountains, in the alignment of fault lines, in the folded remnants of seafloors that once lay beneath sunless oceans. The pulse continues, slower than thought, deeper than memory, and yet it never stops. Maybe a planet doesn't need life to be alive. Maybe breath begins with motion, and if the Earth could learn to move from within, what else might it one day be able to hold? Even in the moments between motion, there was never true stillness. What appeared solid shifted. What looked permanent softened. In the quiet gardens of rock, beneath the ancient ridgelines, beneath the cooling crust, beneath the silence of deep time, disorder was growing. Not with force, but with patience. A kind of slow unraveling. Entropy is not chaos. Not exactly. It is the tendency of things to drift away from order, from symmetry, from alignment, Left alone, systems loosen. Bonds weaken. Structures stretch. And so it was, even in the earliest rocks, patterns formed and fractured. Crystals grew, then cracked. Folds deepened. Grains slipped out of place. Not dramatically, not visibly, but inevitably. In the beginning, minerals often formed with a startling geometry, squares, hexagons, clean planes. But over time, those edges dulled. Pressures shifted. Heat cycled. Water passed through, carrying ions in and out. What was once sharp became curved. What was once smooth became worn. And yet, the change was beautiful. Could it be that erosion is not just subtraction, but a kind of remembering? Within deep rock, even now, there are mineral veins that show the path of long-evaporated waters. Fractures that mark the flecks of continents. Microscopic dislocations where atoms shifted in response to stress. These imperfections are not flaws. They are notes, evidence of everything the rock has felt. And slowly, inevitably, entropy writes itself into the structure. Granite becomes gravel. Mountains become hills. Even diamonds, given long enough, would fade. Not because anything is broken, but because time has no interest in precision. Maybe this is how the Earth forgets, not in moments but in degrees. Not by losing its memory all at once, but by letting it drift outward, grain by grain. What was once tightly held becomes loose. What was once a single shape becomes many. And still, new patterns arise. Lichens find footholds in microscopic cracks. Water freezes and expands, splitting rock into fragments. Heat from below warps the crust upward. Sand becomes stone, then sand again. It's not a cycle exactly, but a spiral. Repeating but never returning to quite the same place. A dance of order and disorder played out across billions of years. We see it in the banding of metamorphic rocks. In the stretching of fossils inside folded limestone. In the ripple marks left behind by ancient tides, now frozen in stone and then fractured by frost. Everything shifts, everything settles, and everything eventually changes into something else. What does deep time do to structure? It dissolves its edges. It reveals its core. It strips away what cannot endure, and in doing so, makes space for something new. Could it be that the Earth's true design isn't found in symmetry at all, but in its willingness to let symmetry fall apart? And what if that's the secret of resilience? Not staying the same, but yielding, softening, reforming? In the garden of rock, disorder isn't the end. It's part of the process. A quiet force that shapes without violence, that breaks without malice. It asks nothing, but waits for everything. And if even the most solid things are subject to forgetting, then what does it mean to be stable? What might happen when the next pulse rises from below? The surface listens. And just above that surface, in a breathless dance of ancient motion, the oceans wait. Always waiting, always returning. Long before they were mapped, long before they were named, they were already moving. Not with gentle tides, but with hunger, with persistence, with rhythm deeper than breath. The continents, still young, still raw from birth, had begun to rise. Slabs of crust thickening into land, lifting from the sea like thoughts emerging from silence. But they did not rise unchallenged. The oceans met them with memory, not because water seeks to destroy, but because water knows how to return. Waves began to crash against the newborn edges, not like the waves we know now, shaped by wind, whispered by moons, but waves driven by heat, by tides more powerful than today's, by the proximity of the moon when it still loomed large in the sky. These were ancient tides, wild, towering, pulled by a gravity that had not yet drifted away, every drop a soft chisel. Could it be that the continents were never meant to stay untouched? That the very act of rising meant eventually being worn away? This was not violence. It was intimacy, water wrapping around stone, slowly undoing it, recycling it, returning it. Erosion did not erase the continents, it taught them how to change. Sediment collected where the water calmed. Silt and sand layered themselves, one upon another, building new beds on the ocean floor. Weight grew, pressure deepened, and over time, time longer than language, those sediments became rock once more. Sandstone, shale, Limestone. Memory hardened into layers. And still the oceans kept pressing in. Sometimes they swallowed entire landmasses. Not with waves but with time. With sea level rise. With subsidence. With slow geological drowning. Other times, they retreated, pulling their waters back to reveal what they had sculpted in their absence. Patterns of erosion like brushstrokes. Floodplains shaped by centuries of flood and forgetting. River deltas braided with sediment from mountains that no longer existed. The continents were not fixed. They grew and shrank. They shifted. They wandered. And in every age, the oceans came to meet them again. We can see it now in the rock record, in layers of sandstone hundreds of meters thick, formed beneath shallow seas that no longer exist. In ripple marks preserved in stone, frozen impressions of waves that broke against beaches buried millions of years ago. In fossilized shorelines, now hundreds of miles from any coast, reminders of times when the sea wandered far inland. And it's still happening. Even now, the continents have not stopped rising, and the oceans have not stopped pulling them back. Could it be that the Earth is caught in a slow conversation between land and sea, where no side ever truly wins? Maybe it's not a battle. Maybe it's a relationship. The land offers itself. The sea carries it away. The land rises again, and again, and again. The pattern loops, not as a cycle but as a dialogue, repeating, reshaping, remembering. And if water can carve a mountain into sand, and carry that sand halfway across the world, and press it into stone once more, then what else might it be able to carry? What else, hidden in the tides, is waiting to come ashore again? Maybe it was already here, not on the land, not yet, but nestled in the margins, in places where water lapped softly over warmth, where the ocean met the earth in quiet pools, where clay held moisture like memory, where sunlight reached but did not scorch. The kind of places that go unnoticed now. Swamps, shallows, mud. We think of life as something dramatic, something that began with a spark or a lightning strike, or an accident so improbable that it might never happen again. But maybe it didn't begin with drama. Maybe it began with waiting, because the mud was there. And in the mud there were molecules, not yet alive but not quite simple, carbon-rich, reactive, dancing, attracted to each other not because of thought or need, but because of shape, charge, curiosity written in atoms, organic chemistry unfolding without witness. Could it be that life didn't arrive, but emerged? That the building blocks were already whispering to one another long before they were called alive? These early molecules may have drifted in from space, riding on meteorites that had crossed cold galaxies. Or they may have formed here, deep in volcanic vents or shallow thermal ponds, catalyzed by heat and mineral surfaces, nudged by chance and repetition. Maybe both, maybe neither, but somehow they gathered, they combined, they became more. RNA perhaps came first, a molecule that can both carry information and catalyze reactions. A strange hybrid, a bridge between chemistry and intention. And once that first loop of information formed, once replication was possible, even if it was imperfect, it began. Slowly. So slowly we cannot comprehend it. A world of molecules, learning to copy themselves, to outlast decay, to persist. We often say life began, as though it were a moment, but maybe it was a mood, a leaning, a slow drift toward pattern, a tendency toward persistence. Not because it was destined, but because the mud allowed it. And what is mud, really? It is earth and water, heat and time, a meeting point between the stable and the shifting. It holds onto things that water might carry away. It anchors, surrounds, it nourishes. Maybe it doesn't just support life. Maybe it suggested it. Some of the earliest life forms, if we can call them that, may have floated in filmy layers, bacterial mats stretched thin across warm surfaces, feeding off iron or hydrogen or the strange glow of undersea heat. Others clung to sediments, shallow pools, mineral-rich clays. Their footprints are not bones, not shells, but chemical traces, sulfur isotopes left behind by metabolism, carbon ratios that hint at breath. These soft beginnings were fragile. Entire worlds invisible to the naked eye, cells without nuclei, structures without symmetry. And yet they changed everything. They began to use energy, to divide, to form colonies. They created gradients. They consumed and released. They left behind gases, minerals, and eventually oxygen. Could it be that this was the intention all along? Not a plan, but a pattern? A universe so full of possibility that life was not a miracle, but a consequence? Maybe the Earth didn't create life. Maybe it was conducive to it. Maybe it offered the perfect mess. Mud and minerals, heat and cold, tides and stillness, for chemistry to wander into complexity. And maybe once that door opened, it never closed. Because the descendants of those early forms are still here. Not in fossils, not just in stone, but in us. In the mitochondria of our cells, the enzymes of our blood, the structures of our DNA. We carry that ancient mud in every breath, in every heartbeat, not metaphorically, but literally. The iron in our blood once rusted in Precambrian seas. The salt in our sweat once swirled in tidal pools. We are not just born from the earth. We are made of it. And if life was always waiting in the mud, then what else might be waiting still? What other beginnings might be hiding in places we overlook? And if simplicity could become intention, what else might complexity remember? In the warmth of mineral-rich waters, where heat rose from deep within the crust and mingled with the shimmer of surface light, something ancient was already dreaming. Not in thoughts, not in language, but in chemistry, in repetition, in growth. The earliest microbes, invisible to any future eye, were busy shaping the very air that one day would make eyes possible. There were no forests yet. No moss, no ferns, no trees. Only pools. Shallow, steaming, restless. Hot springs surrounded by stones soft with age. Geysers exhaling gases into a sky that was still unfamiliar, thick with carbon dioxide and streaked with methane haze. And within these pools, nestled in the warmth, the microbes lived. Tiny, fragile, patient. They left no bones. No fossils in the way we usually imagine. But they left something else. Chemical signatures, woven into rock, folded into ancient layers, painted onto the past in isotopes and minerals. Sulfur patterns, carbon ratios, oxidized iron, traces that whisper. Something was here. Something breathed, consumed, transformed. They were not passive. They were architects. Some fed on hydrogen. Others feasted on the minerals drifting through volcanic vents. But a few, quietly and without ceremony, began to use light. Not the way we do, but in a way older, simpler. Photosynthesis. An alchemy of sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. Their waste product? Oxygen. A gas that, at the time, was poisonous to most of life. A gas that would soon begin to change everything. Could it be that the sky was not always blue but made blue? Sculpted not by the heavens but by bacteria? This oxygen, released slowly into oceans and air, didn't rise peacefully. It was swallowed at first, absorbed by iron in the sea, rusting it into layers of red and gray that we now find pressed into banded ironstone. Some of the oldest sedimentary records we have. Oceans turned blood-colored, thick with oxidized particles. And still the microbes continued. Not because they intended to change the planet, but because that's what life does. It alters what surrounds it. It rearranges the rules. And as oxygen accumulated, first hidden, then rising, it began to escape into the atmosphere. It reacted. It lingered. And for the first time, Earth's air began to clear. The red haze thinned. The sky slowly shifted toward blue. Not because the planet planned it, but because microbial dreams had reached high enough to touch the sky. These microbial mats, often forming as biofilms in shallow waters or layered colonies called stromatolites, were not only breathing, they were building. Layer by layer, they created structures. Each layer a record of light and shadow, of nutrient flow, of time. They were cities without walls. Memory without language. Communities bound by energy. Even now, we find fossilized stromatolites in the oldest rocks on Earth. Rippled domes frozen in stone. traces of days that had no names. They speak to us in shape, in layering, in mineral presence. And what they say is simple: we were here and we changed the sky. Can we call them engineers? Gardeners? Do they qualify as minds or simply mechanisms? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the definitions dissolve in the face of time that long. Because they did what few things in the universe ever managed to do. They made atmosphere. They made the conditions for every breath that would come after. And though they're mostly gone now, overshadowed by complex life, by plants and animals and industry, their legacy remains. Inside us, around us, the mitochondria in our cells, the chloroplasts in leaves, the very foundation of the food chain, all trace their ancestry to those first microbial wanderers in warm water. They dreamed in the language of metabolism. They reached for the sun before there were eyes to see it. And the breath we take tonight is because of theirs. And yet, if life once shaped the sky without intention, what else might still be shaping us, quietly, in ways we've yet to notice? Because the sky, though it looks still, was not always the sky we know. It was heavy, opaque, tinted in orange and red and soft brown. A sky more like another planet. It filtered light through thick veils of methane and haze. It carried the breath of volcanoes and the quiet release of iron-laden oceans. For billions of years it lingered like that, strange and dense and unwilling to change. It was not yet a place to breathe, not yet a place to dream, and yet oxygen had already begun to rise. Not quickly, not visibly, but slowly, so slowly, whispered into the world by ancient microbes and their layered, photosynthetic lives. The oxygen was real. It was there, but it didn't stay. It met the world and was immediately taken. By iron in the oceans, by sulfur in the rocks, by everything in the crust that wasn't yet saturated. Every atom of oxygen released by life was absorbed by a world not ready to hold it. Could it be that the planet resisted breath? That it needed to be restructured from the inside before air could belong to the sky? Took time, deep time, longer than the rise of continents, longer than the carving of canyons. The great oxidation event, as we now call it, was not a bang or a flash, it was a tide. A tide made not of water, but of gas, of change. Oxygen slowly accumulated in places it could not be consumed. It seeped into the upper atmosphere. It began to alter light. And still, the sky was not yet blue. Because blue, as we see it, is a trick of scattering. A play of wavelengths. And for that scattering to occur, oxygen alone was not enough. Ozone had to form, that invisible shield of three-part molecules that both protects and refracts. Ozone that rises from oxygen, but only when oxygen is plentiful enough to become complex. That moment, when the sky finally turned from copper to azure, did not come early. Came late, long after microbes had colonized the seas, long after iron had fallen to the ocean floor in vast, rusting bands. Long after the planet had been slowly, carefully prepared. Perhaps the Earth hesitated because breath is not simple. Because oxygen is not only life, it is fire. It is corrosion. It is transformation at the atomic level. Maybe the Earth waited because it had to, or maybe it didn't wait at all. Maybe this was simply the only pace at which it could happen. We look back now, across billions of years, and see gaps in the record. Long silences where the rocks say little, times of stillness, times of erasure, and we wonder why it took so long. But perhaps the story wasn't slow, only invisible. The sky turned blue gradually, like ink drawn through paper. A diffusion, a dawning, and once it did, everything changed. With oxygen came energy. With energy came complexity. The beginnings of cells with nuclei. The first branching into multicellular form, the potential for bodies, movement, thought. But in that long pause before the blue, there was a threshold between a world that only breathed through oceans, and one that could breathe the sky. Could it be that the most important transformations are the ones we can't see? That the sky became what it is now not because the Earth was ready, but because life kept asking again and again and never stopped? And if the air we now take for granted was once a dream spoken only by bacteria, what else, even now, is slowly becoming real, one unseen breath at a time. Because even as the sky turned blue, slowly, almost shyly, the ground beneath it did not rest. It rumbled. It shifted. It cracked open and spilled itself outward, again and again, with no warning and no regret. This planet, this Earth, is not only a cradle for life, but a restless body of its own. Beneath the surface we walk upon, there has always been motion, not steady but sudden, not rhythmic, but eruptive. The quiet patience of oxygen was matched by something louder, deeper. The voice of the mantle, the hunger of pressure. Earthquakes, volcanoes, movements that could erase whole landscapes in the space of a moment, or build new ones in a breath. Each eruption was an act of forgetting, not because it erased the land, but because it remade it. A volcano does not simply destroy, it layers. It buries. It overwrites. Lava spills across riverbeds. Ash smothers forests. Mountains rise where there were once valleys. Islands are born in the open sea. The landscape changes not with age, but with impulse. Memory is pushed beneath fire. And the earthquakes, they are tremors of reorganization. Crust colliding, plates grinding, stress released in a single shudder. A memory fractured, a timeline splintered. Fault lines aren't flaws. They are seams of motion. They are the visible result of something deeper trying to breathe through stone. Could it be that these sudden moments, so feared, so chaotic, are how the earth expresses itself? Maybe not all memory is meant to be preserved. Maybe some is meant to be broken open. Beneath our feet, subduction zones pull old seafloor back into the mantle. Oceanic crust, heavy with sediment and history, is folded down beneath lighter continental plates. And in those depths it melts. It becomes something else. Magma rises, pressure builds, and one day, without schedule or signal, the ground opens. An eruption begins. Ash floats skyward. Light bends around the heat. Gases are released, sulfur, carbon, water vapor, into the sky that life worked so long to create. One cycle feeds the next. Volcanoes, despite their violence, are part of the breath of this world. They give as much as they take. And over time, they leave behind fertile ground. Soils rich with minerals. Landscapes that call to life. New slopes. New shapes. Entire ecosystems born from the cooled blood of the planet. But they also cover what was there before. Fossils lost. Sediments sealed. Rivers redirected. Was Earth forgetting itself? Or learning who it was? Perhaps both. Perhaps memory and change are not opposites, but twins. Geologists find volcanic layers between sedimentary ones like bookmarks, interruptions in the usual rhythm. A moment of heat, followed by return. We can date these layers. We can trace them across continents. We can see the same ash fall in distant places and know that they were once joined by sky. In this way, even eruptions, destructive as they are, leave clues. But earthquakes leave less behind. They shift what already existed. They crack open the past without fire. They do not create new rock. They fracture what is there. And yet, the scars they leave tell a story too. Uplifted seabeds now forming mountain ranges. Former lake bottoms now high above tree lines. A fossilized fish, discovered in stone far from any sea. Could it be that every earthquake is a sentence in a story the planet is still trying to write? Or perhaps it's rewriting. Perhaps there was no original draft. Only version after version. Worlds layered beneath worlds. Each half erased by pressure, by time, by fire. And we, who walk upon these rearrangements, who live in valleys born from rifts and beside peaks built from molten pasts, we carry these changes too. Not just in our cities and settlements, but in the bones of our ancestors, shaped by terrain and climate. In the myths passed down through cultures born in the shadows of volcanoes. In the quiet awe that rises when the ground trembles beneath us. Maybe we sense, even now, that the earth is never finished. Maybe we've always known that the ground we call solid is only briefly so. And if every rupture is both a loss and a beginning, what else might be buried beneath the next breath of fire? Or perhaps, beneath the hush that follows it? Because long before the great ice ages we name in textbooks, before mammoths, before frozen valleys echoing with the breath of wind, there was cold. Deep, unspoken cold. The kind that doesn't arrive all at once, but creeps, quietly. The kind that begins not with snow, but with stillness. The kind that writes its story not in drama, but in pressure. The earth, warm from within and changing from above, has not always been temperate. Even in its earliest days, long before forests or footprints or seasons as we know them, the planet began to shiver. Its orbit shifted, its axis wobbled, the skies dimmed, and in those long, uncertain spans, glaciers were born. Not quickly, not loudly, but patiently, like sleep creeping in beneath heavy lids. These ancient glaciers, some of the first, didn't glide across populated continents or blanket modern poles. They scraped their way across lands no longer visible. Proto-continents drifting in unfamiliar arrangements. Mountains not yet named. Basins where sunlight was a stranger. And as they moved, they did what glaciers always do. They carved. They didn't crash or tumble or roar. They pressed. They dragged. They sculpted. Could it be that the earliest shapes of Earth were made not by fire, but by ice? Beneath their vast weight, rocks fractured. Valleys were gouged. Minerals were rearranged. Fine powder, glacial flour, was ground from ancient stone and scattered into seas, feeding microscopic life. And when the glaciers melted, which they always do, they left silence behind. A silence carved into the land. A silence made of absence. We find their memory in striations, parallel grooves cut into bedrock like fingernails across time. In dropstones, lonely pebbles carried by floating ice, then dropped into fine marine sediment, leaving behind awkward, beautiful disruptions. In tillites, compressed mixtures of stone and dust, the debris of a retreating glacier pressed into permanence. But these records are faint, weathered, subducted, hidden. The deepest cold often leaves the softest voice. And still, they tell us enough. That ice is not a modern thing. That even in a warmer world, cold could find its way in. That Earth has always held this balance between heat and hush. Between molten breath and frozen memory. Could it be that the glaciers knew something we don't? Not in thought, but in motion. They follow gravity, but not greed. They erase, but not at random. They pause where valleys are deepest. They climb over things we call impassable. They retreat, but not forever. They return. And in that return there is rhythm. Planetary inhale and exhale. Advance and release. Erosion and renewal. Glaciers teach the land to be soft and sharp at once. To carry and to crush. To hold history and then to hide it. We often think of cold as lifeless. But glacial landscapes teem with movement. Slow, subtle, alive in ways we're not trained to see. Cracks that shift with the moon. Subglacial lakes that pulse beneath kilometers of ice. Microbial ecosystems tucked into blue shadows, living in meltwater veins no wider than a thread. Even beneath miles of pressure, life endures. Or maybe it waits. Maybe these early glaciers, long before the ages we've bothered to name, were not just sculptors of land, but of possibility. And if ice could leave such a deep impression without ever speaking, what else might be moving across the surface now, unnoticed, remaking the world without a sound? And if ice could leave such a deep impression without ever speaking, what else might be moving across the surface now, unnoticed, remaking the world without a sound? Perhaps, what if something already had? The history we hold, the story of civilization, is so recent, so light. If Earth were a novel written in pages of stone, our cities would occupy the last line of the last paragraph. The ink would still be drying. And yet we speak of the past as though it is ours to define, as though memory only began when we started to write it down. But what if something else, something older, had come before us? Something that didn't last. Or something that left nothing we were taught to look for. Could there have been civilizations before civilization? Not just life. Not just cells in tide pools or microbial filaments beneath the sea. But structure, intention, tools, systems of knowledge that rose not once, but long ago, and then vanished. Not with flame, not with war, but with time. With sediment. With the slow, soft weight of forgetting. What if failure wasn't the end, but the beginning again? Scientists call them technofossils, the hypothetical remains of an industrial or intelligent species embedded in the geological record. But there are no skyscrapers in ancient strata, no fossilized laptops, no cities caught in amber. If something existed, it would not leave behind what we expect. It would be scattered across subtlety. A change in carbon isotopes, a sudden spike in rare earth metals, a layer of synthetic polymers, now crumbled into chemical ghosts. We search the rock for signs, not because we expect to find, but because absence is not always proof. Take the Silurian hypothesis, a thought experiment whispered among planetary scientists and paleontologists. It asks not whether a civilization existed, but whether it could have existed millions of years before us and still be invisible now. If an industrial species had lived 100 million years ago, and then disappeared, how long would its traces last? How long would concrete remain? How long would plastic? Would anything survive subduction, weathering, erosion, burial? The answers are humbling. Even our boldest structures would likely be unrecognizable after a few million years. Our cities would fall. Our steel would rust. Our signals would fade into noise. Most of what we think is permanent isn't, and most of what we believe marks us as different technology, knowledge, culture, may not leave a mark deep enough to last. But geology does remember some things. There are oddities in the record, sudden warmings, spikes in CO2, unexplained changes in sedimentation, ancient extinction events that arrive too fast, too sharp, with no clear asteroid or supervolcano to blame. Could they be natural? Absolutely. Could they be something else? Something forgotten? Maybe, maybe not. What if we are not the first intelligence to emerge on this planet, but only the first to return? The Earth has been habitable for billions of years, and complex life, multicellular, adaptive, has existed for over 600 million. In all that time, in all that span of turning continents and pulsing oceans, is it possible that evolution tried intelligence before, and then let it go? We don't know. We may never know. But we can look. We can follow the isotope trails in ancient shale. We can read the redox changes in buried sediments. We can study the layers of clay and ash and find anomalies that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. A civilization's ghost, not in ruins, but in ratios. In a chemical echo that only speaks if you know how to listen. And perhaps the deepest question isn't whether someone came before, but whether it matters if they did. Because if they rose and fell and vanished without trace, what does that say about permanence? What does that say about us? Maybe civilizations are not meant to last. Maybe they're meant to bloom like rare minerals, then dissolve. Maybe the universe is not empty of intelligence, just quiet. Quiet with the memory of things that didn't stay. And maybe, just maybe, we are the technofossils of someone else's future. A brief pulse in the stone, a curious layer, a change in the carbon. And yet, if this much can be erased, what else might we already be walking over? Maybe ourselves. Because beneath the cities we've built, beneath the roads and rails and runways, beneath the mines we've opened and the oceans we've altered, we are already layering our future. Not in monuments or museums or stories passed down, but in dust, in chemistry, in strange new alloys and long-lived polymers, in isotopes shifted by energy we learned to harness before we fully understood its shadow. Geologists call them technofossils, artifacts not of biology, but of technology. Objects, residues, and signals that might someday tell the story of us, if there is anyone left to listen. Not because we tried to be remembered, but because forgetting takes time. What would another intelligence, far in the future, see in us? Would they find plastic embedded in sedimentary rock, microbads and wrappers compressed into geological layers, fused with sand and shell fragments beneath the pressure of time? Would they see the signature of our metals? Aluminum, titanium, synthetic alloys that nature never forged, now scattered through the crust in landfills and fragments and fractured cores? Would they read the spike in carbon dioxide, the residue of nuclear isotopes, the subtle rearrangement of mineral ratios from mining and smelting and burning and building? Could memory be buried in metal? Not the kind we write in, but the kind we leave behind. Lithium, once locked deep in the earth, now woven into millions of batteries. Rare earths, concentrated in places where no natural process would have placed them. Strontium signatures in the bones of animals we raised, fed, and buried. Even the quiet pollen of monoculture plants, wheat, corn, rice, drifting across continents, layered into soil like an agricultural fingerprint. And yet, so much of it might vanish. Our paper will rot. Our screens will darken. Our satellites will fall and corrode. Buildings will collapse. Concrete will crack. Cities will be swallowed by roots, by rain, by time. What remains may not look like us. It may not even resemble civilization. It may be subtle, a layer of ash, a streak of soot, a sudden transition in the geologic record, a thin horizon of anomaly marking the Anthropocene, the age of humans, not by presence but by rupture. Could it be that we are writing our legacy in forms we cannot read? Maybe we think of memory as story, but the Earth remembers differently. It remembers in accumulation, in interruption, in difference. Just as we find ancient volcanic eruptions in fine lines of tephra buried deep in ice, maybe someone or something might one day find us. In the chemistry of coral, in the voids where groundwater used to run, in the mineral scars of extraction. Pause in the rock. A shift in the breath of the planet. And what would they think? Would they see a civilization that lasted barely a blink, but changed the biosphere for millions of years to come? Would they see extinction patterns triggered by temperature and acid and time? Would they see us as a species that reached for the stars? Or one that forgot how to live on its own world? Maybe, maybe not, because perhaps we are not writing a fossil, but a question. One that only deep time can answer. One whose echo depends not on how long we last, but how deeply we settle into the earth we've altered. Our mark is not just in what we've built, but in what we've changed, in what can never return to how it was before. And still, beneath our feet, the ground carries on. It moves, compacts, it stratifies, it layers, slowly turning our present into geology, our objects into or our mistakes into signal. Not because the earth seeks to remember us, but because it never stops recording. And if the planet keeps track of us long after we're gone, what future reader might someday hold that page and ask softly, what happened here? Maybe the page is already written, not in script, not in stone tablets or scattered bones, but in something smaller, quieter, the atoms themselves, in carbon, in uranium, in the light breath of oxygen that slips into shells and snow. The earth has its own language for remembering, and it speaks in isotopes. Every element tells time, not like a clock, but like a trace. Some isotopes are stable, unchanging, content to simply exist. Others are restless. They decay. Slowly, predictably, they shed mass like memory, transforming into something else, ticking forward with every passing million years. We measure that decay and we call it age. Radiometric dating, we say. Carbon-14 for the recent dead. Uranium lead for the oldest rocks. Potassium-argon for volcanic whispers. Strontium, neodymium, oxygen-18. Periodic table of echoes. But what are we really hearing? Do isotopes interpret history, or merely report it? When we hold a zircon crystal and know it cooled 4.4 billion years ago, is that a story? Or just a timestamp? When we trace shifts in oxygen isotopes in polar ice, marking warm spells and cold snaps, are we reading a diary? Or just a pattern? There is no narrative in an atom, but there is rhythm. There is sequence. There is something like pulse. Maybe that's all memory is. Take carbon. It cycles through every living thing, through the breath of animals and the leaves of trees, through volcanoes, oceans, soil. And as it moves, it leaves behind clues. Ratios of carbon-12 to carbon-13 shift with photosynthesis, with decay, with fire. In coal, we find a fingerprint of long-dead forests. In shells, a trace of plankton long dissolved. In graphite, a whisper from deep time, locked in a matrix of metamorphosed memory. Then there is uranium, buried in the crust, slowly decaying into lead. This half-life is so long it barely moves in a human life, but in Earth's time, it marches forward. And by measuring its decay, we measure silence. We calculate age not from presence, but from absence. What's gone tells us what once was. And oxygen, so light, so common, shifts between its isotopes with changes in temperature and ice. The Earth's ancient climate is preserved in its breath, in the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in tiny bubbles trapped in glacial ice, or in foraminifera that once floated in shallow seas. We can hold a fossil, crack it open, and read the warmth of an Eocene summer, or the bitter chill of a snowball Earth. Not because the shell remembers, but because the oxygen inside it never forgot. Isotopes don't tell stories the way we do. They don't choose. They don't dramatize. But maybe that makes them more honest. They remember not through meaning, but through mathematics, through balance, through inevitable change. Could it be that the planet doesn't just carry memory? It is memory? That every mountain, every glacier, every raindrop and fault line is not a mark upon the Earth, but a sentence within it? When we drill into ice cores, when we crush minerals in mass spectrometers, when we follow the decay chains from thorium to lead, we are not discovering something new. We are decoding something ancient, reading a language that was never written, only lived, a language of mass and time and transformation. And if we are learning to listen, who else might one day do the same? Maybe memory doesn't need eyes. Maybe memory can live in crystal, in dust, in ratios that outlast civilizations. And if time is written into matter itself, what other stories lie waiting in the atoms we haven't yet learned to hear? Maybe one of those stories belongs not to us, but to a planet just across the void. A planet that once might have been a sister and still might be a mirror. Venus. Same size, same age, same rocky bones. Born from the same cloud of dust and fire that gave us Earth. For a time, maybe a very long time, they weren't so different. Both worlds spun beneath early suns, wrapped in volcanic skies, oceans forming, crusts rising, clouds gathering. But somehow only one of them became us. What made Earth different? Maybe it was luck. A small tilt, a slightly farther orbit, just enough room for water to linger and clouds to break. Or maybe it was something more, a balance so delicate we still don't fully understand it, between heat and gravity and breath. Because on Venus, the balance was lost. Today, the surface of Venus is hot enough to melt lead. Its atmosphere is thick, suffocating, made mostly of carbon dioxide. The pressure on the ground would crush bones in seconds. And high above that ground, the sky isn't blue. It's pale yellow, filled with clouds of sulfuric acid, slowly churning, endlessly hiding the sun. No rivers, no rain, no plate tectonics to recycle the crust. No winds that bring relief, only heat trapped forever. But it wasn't always like this. There are hints, faint, controversial but worth wondering over, that Venus may once have had oceans. Liquid water, maybe even for hundreds of millions of years. That once, the clouds parted. That once, like us, it may have known tides and sunlight and the gentle chemistry of habitability. And then, something tipped. A runaway greenhouse effect. Perhaps volcanic activity released more carbon dioxide than the planet could absorb. Perhaps the oceans began to evaporate, releasing even more water vapor, a greenhouse gas of its own. As temperatures rose, the feedback loop intensified. More evaporation, more heat, more carbon, more clouds, less light. Eventually, the oceans boiled away. The water vanished. And with it, any chance of recovery. Could that have been us? Maybe, maybe not. Earth has its own cycles of warming and cooling, its own volatile history, but something held it back. The carbon here is stored, locked in rocks, in trees, in life. Subduction buries it. Rain dissolves it. Algae breathe it. And, somehow, this cycle, fragile and imperfect, has kept the sky from closing in. But what if one day it hadn't? What if a slight shift in orbit had brought us just a little closer to the sun? What if early Earth had just one more round of volcanism, or just a little less silicate weathering, or just a slightly longer delay in the arrival of life to trap carbon in shells? Would our oceans have vanished too? Would we now be lost beneath clouds, waiting for someone else to ask, from far away, what might have been? Venus does not speak. It reflects. Its surface is young, volcanically renewed, resurfaced by eruptions so recent they may still be happening now. Its craters are few, as though time itself was wiped clean. But its silence is deep, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from forgetting. We send probes. We listen to the wind. We measure the gases and trace their isotope ratios, hoping for clues. Because in Venus we might find not a sibling, but a warning. Not a failed Earth, but an alternate one. Path not taken. A reflection of what happens when the balance breaks. As Earth shifted, cooled, and bloomed, sometimes in fire, sometimes in frost, there was always a presence above, keeping time without ticking. The moon, pale, cratered, unmoving in its silence, and yet always moving, always circling, always there. The Earth's twin not twin, its offspring and its anchor, a remnant of the same collision that nearly ended everything, but instead gave the world rhythm, tides, and a silent companion to witness its unfolding. While Earth became dynamic, green and blue and broken and alive, the moon remained still. No air, no plate tectonics, no breath to erase the scars of its past. The surface holds every blow it's ever received, every impact, every moment, a fossil record of silence. What does it mean to orbit your own origin story? The moon does just that, endlessly circling the place it came from. Not a satellite in the cold sense of mechanics, but a memory, a shadow that never left, a reminder carved in gravity. It watches not with eyes, but with presence. It reflects not thought, but light. It turns its face toward us, always the same side, while the other remains hidden. Not out of secrecy, but because of balance. Maybe there's something tender in that, something unspoken. The Earth dreaming in mountains and oceans and air, the moon circling in quiet reply. Their relationship is not simple, is not still. The moon is drifting slowly, slowly, away from us. About 4 centimeters a year, a fingernail's width, but across the eons it matters. One day, a billion years from now, there may be no more perfect eclipses, no more total alignments of shadow and sun. The balance will slip, the dance will shift, but for now it remains. And with every pass, the moon pulls at our oceans. It draws the tides across continents, sculpts coastlines, stirs the deep. It slows the Earth's spin, lengthening the days ever so slightly. Once, the Earth spun much faster, the moon closer, the days shorter. But as the moon moved away, time stretched. We stretched. Could it be that the length of our days, our sense of time, our very rhythm, has always been written by this silent witness? And if so, what else do we owe it? Without the moon's pull, perhaps plate tectonics would move differently. Perhaps seasons would falter. Perhaps life would never have stabilized. Maybe the tides fed the tidipools that gave rise to thought. Maybe that distant disk, glowing above ancient forests and forgotten seas, was more than just reflection. Maybe it was permission. And even now, the moon holds more than gravity. It holds history. Its surface carries dust that has not been moved in billions of years. It holds fragments of the early solar system, untouched, waiting. Its isotopes match ours. Its bones are our bones. When we look at it, we are looking at something familiar, not foreign. Something that left us, but didn't leave us behind. Is that what all memory is? A circling presence? Not intrusive, not loud, but always returning. Always hovering just far enough to see, just close enough to feel. And if the Earth is the dreamer, blooming with life and change and forgetting, maybe the moon is the witness who never stops watching, who never turns away, who remembers everything, even the parts we've erased. And yet, if the moon holds the memory, and the Earth holds the story, what might still rise between them, written in shadow and orbit and time? Maybe us, and everything we call now. But what is now, really, when placed inside 4.5 billion years, feels solid, the present, immediate, tangible. We mark it with hours and moments, with calendars, with clocks. We live in it, speak from it, build our lives around it. But to the earth now is barely anything at all. Not a pause, not a breath, not even the cooling of a stone. If deep time could speak, if the earth could whisper across epochs, what would it say about this instant we call the present? Would it laugh softly at how brief it is, or marvel at how much we try to fit inside it? Because to geology there is no now. There is only becoming. Rocks do not mark the passing of seconds. Oceans do not measure minutes. Volcanoes do not erupt on schedule. They move according to pressures built over millennia. They shift because of tectonic drift, mantle heat, planetary inertia. Their time is wide and slow, but we are not built to sense that slowness. Our perception is tuned to the narrowest band of motion. Whether seasons, a lifetime, even a century to us, feels long. But it is nothing. A blink. A single swirl in a planet's endlessly shifting surface. And yet, we hold on to it. Desperately. We call it real. We call it now. Could it be that our sense of the present is an illusion? A trick of perspective? Like mist rising from a deep valley, lit briefly by the sun, before disappearing again? The rocks beneath our feet remember more than we do. They've survived ice and fire, flood and drought, erosion and uplift. They've been part of mountain ranges that no longer exist, coastlines that once kissed other continents. They've carried the footprints of creatures long gone, and will carry ours too, if only briefly. We leave our mark in shallow grooves, sidewalks, foundations, quarries, names scratched into walls. But time, true time, does not pause to admire or preserve. Keeps moving, softly, relentlessly. Even this very moment, your breath, this voice, this listening has already become the past. Maybe that's not frightening. Maybe it's freeing. Because if now is always slipping, maybe permanence was never the point. Maybe what matters isn't how long the present lasts, but how gently we move through it. The earth has no single memory of the present. It collects moments the way sediment collects in riverbeds, slowly, unevenly, in layers that compress with time. Most of what happens is erased, washed away, forgotten. Only the rarest pieces are preserved. A tooth in clay, pollen grain in ice, a ripple frozen in sandstone. We are not separate from this. We are part of the sediment, part of the layering. Our now is already folding into the rock record, one breath at a time. Is the present real? Of course. But only in the way a flame is real, as long as there is fuel, as long as it is fed. And even then, its light races ahead, already gone before we can name it. Maybe the illusion isn't that now exists, but that we ever thought it could stay. And if that's true, if every moment is already slipping into the canyon of deep time, then what are we really trying to hold? And yet, if this is how little the present truly weighs, what does that say about the things we've forgotten? Not the loud things, not the towering bones or the shattered meteors or the ash that buried cities in an instant, but the quiet things, the ones that barely made a sound, the ones so soft they might have disappeared before they were ever noticed. A single footprint in volcanic dust, the trace of a leaf on shale, or a fossil that once was only a raindrop. Because even that is possible. There are places, few, precious, where stone holds the imprint of falling water. Not the river or the flood, not even a storm, but the briefest moment. A single drop striking soft mud, just as the surface was ready to receive it, just before the wind could erase it, just before another drop could flatten the ripple, just before the light shifted. The earth noticed, and it remembered, and in that imprint, a shallow circle, feathered at the edges, no larger than a fingernail, is a record of motion, of atmosphere, of surface tension and weight and speed. It is not just a shape. It is physics frozen, climate preserved, a whisper from a sky that no longer exists, that fell upon land long subducted, long eroded, long forgotten. What else have we missed? quietly fossilized and overlooked. Maybe we search too often for the large, for the bones, for the teeth, for the monumental. But sometimes memory is gentler. Sometimes it hides in the negative space, in the things that are no longer there but left an impression behind. An ancient worm that wriggled through seafloor mud, leaving only a thin burrow. A fern that pressed against silt, leaving behind a ghost of itself, now darker than the stone it lies within. The outline of feathers, delicate as lace, from a creature whose name we no longer know. These are not fossils in the dramatic sense. They are whispers, hints, the earth remembering in textures, in impressions, in the places where presence once pressed against presence, and the surface was soft enough to hold it. Could it be that the planet is covered in these quiet archives? That for every grand fossil in a museum drawer, there are 1,000 smaller truths, still buried, still waiting? A rain print, a breeze-marked ripple, the scratch of a claw against a tree long turned to stone. And how many of them have been weathered away, crushed beneath footsteps, lost to time not because they were erased, but because no one ever thought to look. Maybe memory isn't what stays. Maybe it's what tries to stay. The raindrop fossil tells us something important, not about the drop itself but about the conditions, the chance, the readiness of the land to receive it. The way soft sediment held its breath just long enough before hardening. The way silence lingered after the fall, not because it had to, but because the moment allowed it. Could it be that history, too, is formed not just by what happens, but by where and how it lands? And if so, what moments are we standing on now that have already tried to leave their mark? What present-day impressions are quietly being recorded, in places we cannot see, in ways we cannot yet understand? And yet, if even water can leave behind a fossil, what else might time still be holding in the hollows between raindrops and stone? Perhaps memory isn't only about what's left behind, but what draws everything inward, what holds it all together. Planet, after all, is not born in a moment. It becomes, slowly, not because it chooses but because it is pulled, molded, weathered, over eons under pressure, by heat, by collapse, by the rhythm of return. Identity, it seems, has weight, and gravity. Earth has always had its own kind of gravity. Not only the physics that keeps moons in orbit and oceans pulled close, but the subtler kind. The pull of recurrence, the tug of repetition. Day becoming night, night becoming day, over and over until it feels inevitable. Until it feels like Earth intended it. Until it becomes habit and then heritage. But what if the cycles we trust were never planned? What if identity is not discovered, but accumulated? We are so used to seeing the Earth as it is, blue, breathing, marked by life. But it wasn't always like this. It didn't always carry oceans. It didn't always spin beneath a sky painted in oxygen and cloud. There were ages when it didn't yet know itself, when its crust was still soft, when its atmosphere was only gas and suspicion, when fire had not yet become memory, before tectonics formed continents, before those continents fractured, drifted, collided, drowned, before erosion carved valleys, before fossils etched time into rock, before even the idea of life had learned to try. And yet, something was always pulling, shaping, not just physically but subtly, emotionally. The Earth has mood swings in epochs. It has long silences and sudden, violent shifts. It weeps in rain. It breathes in ice. It scars easily but heals in slow, thoughtful centuries. And just as easily, it forgets. It forgets whole forests, whole seas, whole atmospheres. There is loss baked into its rhythm. And somehow, even in that loss, something endures. Could it be that a planet's personality is not defined by its surface, but by its patterns of forgetting and returning? There are echoes in Earth's orbit of lunar pull and solar dance. There are whispers in its mantle, in the push and stretch of molten convection. A strange, slow memory in the tectonic drift of plates that have no idea they were once one, that they will one day meet again, not because they remember, but because movement itself is a kind of instinct. Maybe identity isn't just what you are, but what you repeat. We often speak of Earth as if it's passive, as if things simply happen to it, as if erosion erases, as if time softens, as if entropy wins. But what if the planet participates? What if it responds, resists, adapts? Not with intention, but with pattern. Not with will, but with rhythm? Could it be that Earth is trying to become something even now, only very, very slowly? And if the Earth has a personality, what about us? We're made of its elements. Carbon, calcium, salt. The iron in our blood once drifted through magma. The water in our cells once steamed from stone. We are not visitors here, we are Earth, briefly aware of itself. Earth in pause. Earth trying to remember. Our breath is its atmosphere recycled. Our thoughts are shaped by seasons and time zones and gravity itself. We live in cycles not because we choose to, but because we come from a place that does. And maybe, just maybe, we inherit not only the substance of this world, but the pattern of its becoming. Is it possible, then, that our identities, our questions, our memories, our myths are shadows of geologic habits? Not because we learned them, but because we absorbed them. Not because they were taught, but because they were etched. Maybe, maybe not. But if the Earth's true character lies in its balance between motion and stillness, between chaos and rhythm, between memory and erosion, then perhaps ours does too. And yet, if we are made of the same gravity that shaped oceans, what else might we carry? Deep within us. Still pulling, still forming, still unknown. And yet, if we carry gravity within us, pulling toward something unspoken, what happens when everything is pulled apart? The Earth has known silence deeper than any we can imagine. Silence not born of stillness, but of absence. The kind that arrives after everything that was no longer is, long before us, and long before memory had bones. There were moments when life itself folded inwards, vanished, and began again. Not just once, but 5 great times. Maybe more. The history we hold is incomplete, because even memory can die. Extinction, we call it. But what is that word? Really? An end? A reset? A forgetting? Perhaps extinction is not the vanishing of life, but the rearranging of it. Entropy with intention. A strange kind of punctuation. Earth, as it turns out, writes its sentences with silence. Whole chapters closed with fire, flood, and ice. And then, almost impossibly, renewal, regrowth. A strange blooming from beneath the ash. There were trilobites once. Entire worlds of them. They moved through seas that no longer exist, under skies with different chemistries. They were complex, resilient. They adapted. Until they didn't. The end came not in war or drama, but in pressure, in climate swings, in volcanic breath, in quiet changes too slow to notice until it was too late. And they were gone. Not because they were weak, but because the system shifted, and they could no longer find themselves inside it. Entropy always wins in the long run. Structures decay. Order softens. Heat spreads. But somehow, in the very unraveling of what was, new forms emerge. After the Devonian extinction, fish became the ancestors of landwalkers. After the Permian, mammals began to whisper toward the future. After the Cretaceous, the world opened wide for feathers, flowers, and us. Could it be that life uses destruction as a ladder? Maybe we think of extinction as tragedy because we see it from within. Because we live on the edge of a timeline we can't see the whole of. But from above or from afar, might it just be another phase? A necessary clearing? A renewal hidden inside collapse? Not because life wants to restart, but because it must, because it can. The rock record doesn't scream. It hums. If you listen closely, it tells you stories in layers. Thick bands of limestone give way to thin trails of clay, dark with soot, rich with iridium, cosmic dust from an asteroid that ended an age. Below that line, teeth. Above it, seeds. What if every fossil is a word? What if every extinction is an edit? Even the atmosphere remembers. Oxygen levels rise and fall with breathless epochs. Carbon gathers, disappears, resurfaces in new forms. Volcanoes bury continents beneath basalt. Oceans drown whole biomes. Tectonic swallows islands like sentences deleted mid-thought. Still, somehow the story keeps going. Why? Perhaps entropy isn't just a measure of disorder. Perhaps it's the necessary erosion of certainty, a way to prevent stagnation, to keep things moving, to make room for surprise. Maybe extinction is Earth's way of pausing, exhaling, and dreaming a different dream. And in that dream we find strange echoes of our own nature. We build, we decay, we forget, we begin again. Our cultures rise with ideas and crumble under their own weight. Technologies bloom and fossilize. We grow through failure, not in spite of it. Could it be that we, too, carry the logic of extinction in our evolution? Not because we wish to collapse, but because we don't yet know what we are becoming. There is comfort in knowing that even when life seems to vanish, Earth does not give up on itself. After every fall, there is always a strange kind of sunrise. Something unexpected, something fragile and new, a fern curling out of blackened soil, a single mammal surviving under the feet of dinosaurs, a line of cells in the ocean daring to try photosynthesis again. Maybe reinvention is Earth's default state. Maybe survival isn't about resisting change, but dancing with it. And maybe, just maybe, every extinction is a quiet agreement between entropy and life. You may undo me, but I will not disappear. I will come back in a new form. I will return, altered. And yet, if erasure itself can give birth to imagination, what else might we owe to the forgotten? The Earth, after all, was not born in peace. It was sculpted by trauma, forged not in gentle unfolding, but in fire, pressure, and the deep, resounding echo of collision. Not one, but many, one after another, over eons, over silence, over dust. We are not simply made of stardust. We are made of aftermath. The wreckage of what came before. The remains of everything that didn't survive. And somehow, the memory of that violence lives on in us. There was once a moment long ago when the sky split open. A Mars-sized body, nameless now, veered close, too close, and changed everything. The moon was born from it. But so were we. Earth was never the same again. Its crust shattered. Its tilt was altered. Its rotation rewound. What had been was undone, and what would be had just barely begun. Was that violence an accident? A mistake? Or was it necessary? Maybe not because Earth needed to break, but because life needed a stage. Because a planet without scars has no room for dreaming. We often forget that what survives us isn't us. What we leave behind is never whole. But in geology, fragments are enough. Shards tell stories. Isotopes remember heat. The tilt of the Earth remembers the angle of that collision. Tides remember the moon that rose from it. And we, our hands, our cells, our breath, carry the echo still. Could it be that everything we are is shaped by that first great wound? Not metaphorically, but literally. The core churns the way it does because of that collision. The length of our days, the rhythm of our years, the oxygen we breathe, all traceable in spirals and loops to that one impossible moment of chaos. And chaos doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means rearrangement, realignment, a chance to begin again on different terms. The ancient rock layers say nothing in words, but their silence isn't empty. If you listen closely, the stones murmur with compression, with fractures, with minerals formed only under unthinkable pressure. The Earth remembers being hit, but it does not mourn. It integrates, it evolves. It does not seek perfection. It seeks possibility. So what does it mean to be born from wreckage? Maybe it means we are not failures for being broken. Maybe we are not wrong for carrying impact in our bones. Maybe pain isn't the opposite of life. Maybe it's the start of it. Over and over, Earth has proven that ruin can be fertile. That after the fires die down and the shockwaves settle, something delicate, unexpected, and entirely new can rise. We call that resilience. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's a kind of geological forgiveness. The willingness of matter to keep moving, to soften, to become. Because to be alive is to keep going even when the map is ash. We look up at the moon now and see romance, myth, comfort, but it began as an accident. A burst of dust and stone flung into orbit, cooling slowly, watching us. Its face unchanging, its voice silent, and yet it has shaped our nights, our tides, our hearts. A scar turned companion, a wound turned clock. If we trace ourselves back, not through generations, but through tectonic time, we find not kings or queens, not creatures or kingdoms, but heat, force, collapse. The building blocks of life did not arrive in gentle packages. They rode comets. They struck surfaces. They boiled. They cracked. They collided. And eventually, they settled. Is it possible, then, that what we call identity is built on echoes? That every thought we have reverberates from something unimaginably ancient? That our love for light, for rhythm, for circles and seasons, is rooted in the spin that began the moment Earth collided with its would-be twin? We are not the first to feel this weight. The mantle of Earth has shifted under countless skies. And with every impact, with every extinction, with every loss, Earth did not forget. It folded the memory into its layers. In shocked quartz, in melted glass, in the alignment of crystals that whisper, something once struck here, and the world was never the same. And we, too, carry the memory of impact. In mythologies, in lullabies, in our need to name what we don't understand, in our longing for origin, for meaning, for permanence in a world that has never stopped rearranging itself. Not because we seek control, but because deep down we remember being dust. And yet, if even the sky can fracture and become whole again, what else might we learn from the pieces? There is a language beneath our feet, but it does not speak in syllables. It speaks in layers, in the tilt of a fossil half buried in shale, in the isotopic signature of a glacier long since melted into air, in the quiet absence of something that used to be there, but no longer is. Earth does not record with words, but with memory made physical, dust, stone, and the long patience of decay. And though its script is slow, and its punctuation carved by wind, the message is always there. Waiting, subtle, a whisper in basalt, a question in quartz. To read this language is not to look for narrative, but for evidence. Not for plot, but for rhythm. Because Earth does not remember like we do. It does not organize by meaning. It remembers by presence, by pressure, by what refuses to be erased. A volcanic glass cooled too quickly. A ripple frozen in time beneath what used to be a lake. The slight skew in oxygen isotopes that hints, softly, and only if we ask the right way, that the air once carried more warmth or more ice. Maybe we are used to forgetting, but the Earth does not forget. It folds its memories into cliffs. It buries them in sediment. It reshapes them into mountains, only to wear them back down again, grain by grain, without ever losing the story. What if every pebble we walk on once held the edge of a coastline, long vanished? What if each grain of sand is a broken syllable from a continent that tried to speak and then disappeared? The oldest rocks do not tell us everything, but they tell us enough. And what they tell is not just history, it is philosophy in stone. That change is inevitable. That pressure leaves residue. That time moves in circles, not lines. We think of geology as a science of stillness, but it is a science of motion too slow for us to see. Plates drift imperceptibly. Oceans rise and fall like breath. Islands emerge, burn, and drown in silence. And in that silence, history is carved. Sometimes the only trace is a mineral out of place. A zircon born in fire, now resting in silt. Sometimes it's the absence of fossils, telling us that life hadn't yet arrived, or had arrived, then vanished again. There are ghost continents we cannot name. Landmasses that rose before Pangea, shattered, and were swallowed by the mantle without leaving even a song. Could it be that our own memories are too short to grasp this kind of loss? Maybe we've mistaken forgetting for emptiness. Maybe what we call blank space is just a different kind of record. Entropy plays its hand, as it always does, Patterns unravel. Mountains crumble. Sediment washes away into the deep. But even decay has shape. Even disorder has a fingerprint. There are trails left behind by elements that should not have been there, and yet were. Clues tucked inside the ratios of carbon-12 to carbon-13, whispering of past atmospheres and extinct ecosystems. It's not a loud story. It's not even a clear one. But it's consistent, persistent, honest in ways language never quite is. We are latecomers to this archive, and our questions are sharp and fast, while Earth's answers are soft and slow. But still we ask, and still it replies. In dust, in rock, in silence stretched over billions of years. The crust moves, the mantle circulates, the outer shell fractures and heals again and again, until even the breaks become part of the story. What we call erosion, the Earth calls editing. What we call extinction, it calls revision. Could it be that we, too, are just another line in this unfinished text? Not the end. Not the point. Just a moment, written in sediment and forgotten wind. Not because we don't matter, but because everything matters equally here. The algae, the granite, the buried breath of an animal that never left bones behind. Each part layered into the next, each a verse in a poem whose ending no one knows. And yet, if stone can remember fire, and water can etch memory into cliffs, what else might the planet be telling us? Right now, beneath our feet, the moon still rises. Slow, silver, constant. Always in orbit, never arriving. It casts its quiet light across oceans that no longer resemble the ones it first stirred. It has watched entire continents drift apart like puzzle pieces left in the rain. It has seen forests rise and fall, deserts move like breath, rivers carve through mountains and forget they ever tried to resist. And still, it rises, and still, the Earth turns, a little older, a little different, but not entirely changed. Beneath that familiar glow, Earth breathes in silence. Not because it is still, but because it has learned how to move without noise. The crust shifts. The mantle roils. The deep places hum in frequencies no ear can hear. There is motion in the core, in the plates, in the deep subduction zones that pull entire histories down into the dark. But the moon doesn't blink. It simply follows, watches, waits. There is something haunting in that loyalty, in the orbit that never ends. For every turn of the Earth, the moon is there, tugging, tilting, reminding. The tides come and go not because they choose to, but because they are summoned. Not because they are alive, but because something long ago stitched motion into gravity, and gravity into rhythm, and rhythm into life. Could it be that the moon is a kind of memory too? Not written in layers, but in distance, in orbit, in shadow, a scar that circles back forever. Maybe that's all the moon ever was, a reminder of impact, of violence, of change, a relic from the moment Earth was nearly lost to chaos, but instead became something else, something whole, something wounded and dreaming. We look up and see a cold companion, but the Earth might look up and see a mirror. The moon does not forget what Earth once was. It remembers the blast that gave it form. It remembers the heat, the separation, the centrifugal mourning of a planet pulling away from itself. Even now, it recedes bit by bit, measured in millimeters each year. The space between Earth and moon is growing, slowly, reluctantly, like an old embrace coming undone. And still, the tides flow, not because they must, but because they remember. They remember a time when water first kissed rock, when salt first seeped into fractures, when the very notion of erosion was born. Every wave, every pull, every crash against the shore is an echo of that early longing. Gravity pulling, stone yielding, ocean rising, then falling, then rising again. We stand on this planet as if it is solid, permanent, but it isn't. It's a palimpsest of worlds layered atop each other, one after another. Ghost continents, buried oceans, forests turned to coal, mountains raised and then erased. All stacked beneath our feet like forgotten dreams. The Earth carries them all, not because it wants to remember, but because it cannot help it. There is no delete key in geology. There is only pressure. And time. Maybe it's not memory that fades, but access. Maybe the Earth remembers everything. The Earth still turns. The moon still rises. And we are here for only a moment long enough to wonder, to look up and see not just a glowing circle, but a story, to look down and feel not just dirt, but history, to feel gravity and know that it is more than force, it is inheritance. The quiet pull of every past version of Earth, asking not to be forgotten. Sometimes it's easy to believe the Earth is mute, that it doesn't speak. But that's not true. It just speaks slowly. In basalt, in isotope drift, in the ghost of a raindrop fossilized in sandstone, in the tilt of the moon's orbit, in the way continents once met, and then let go. And isn't that memory? Not a recording, but a rhythm? Not a picture, but a pattern? We live in a version of Earth that has seen everything. It has seen extinction and abundance, silence and symphony, heat and ice. It has been a world of fire, a world of rain, a world of shadows, and now a world with us. But we are not the first story, and we will not be the last. We are a page in a book written by pressure and cooled by time. We are a tide, a trace, a temporary breath in a planet that never truly sleeps. So when the moon rises again tonight, when its pale light touches your face and the shadows grow long and soft, remember this. The moon is not just light. It is memory, and Earth, turning quietly beneath it, carries every version of itself, still glowing in the dark. And yet, if this much can be remembered, what else might still be waiting, just beneath the silence?